The Sapphire Lounge was a symphony of clinking crystal, low jazz, and the intoxicating scent of expensive gin and unspoken wealth. William Carter navigated the crowded room, his eyes scanning for the emerald silk dress of his wife of 7 years, Margot, eager to share the news of their latest acquisition. He found her in the dimly lit alcove near the terrace, but the smile died on his lips before it could fully form. She wasn't holding a champagne flute. Her hands were tangled in the lapels of a dark suit worn by a man William didn't recognize. And as she leaned up, pressing her lips against his in a kiss of desperate, practiced familiarity, the illusion of William's perfect life shattered instantly. If stories of quiet devastation, hidden truths, and the agonizing unraveling of a marriage speak to the darker corners of your heart, stay with me. The Sapphire Lounge was an institution in Chicago's Loop, a place where fortunes were whispered into existence over crystal tumblers of scotch. Tonight it had been rented out entirely for the 7th anniversary of Sinclair Ventures. The air was thick with the scent of expensive gin, melting candle wax, and the quiet hum of predatory success. William Carter was 30 minutes late. A delayed flight from New York had kept him from arriving with his wife, Margot. As he handed his tailored cashmere coat to the hostess, he smoothed the lapels of his charcoal suit, a genuine smile softening the usually sharp angles of his face. He was exhausted, but the thought of seeing Margot anchored him. 7 years of marriage, and the sight of her still possessed the power to quiet the relentless noise in his mind. He moved through the crowded room, nodding politely to partners and politicians, his eyes scanning the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. He was looking for emerald green. Margot had mentioned her dress that morning over coffee, a vintage silk piece that clung to her like a second skin. The jazz band shifted into a slow, melancholic tempo. The lighting in the lounge was intentionally moody, casting long, dramatic shadows against the velvet-draped walls. William saw the emerald silk first. She was standing in a secluded alcove near the frosted glass doors leading to the terrace. William's step faltered, the smile on his face freezing into a stiff, unnatural mask. Margot wasn't alone. A man stood with her. He was tall, wearing a midnight blue suit, his dark hair catching the dim light. But it wasn't the proximity that stopped William's heart. It was the posture. It was the total, absolute collapse of personal space. William stood paralyzed behind a pillar, 15 feet away. He watched, a suffocating vacuum forming in his chest as the man reached up, his hand tangling gently, familiarly, into the elegant sweep of Margot's hair at the nape of her neck. "Pull away!" William's mind screamed. "Margot, step back!" She didn't. Instead, her hand moved up to rest flat against the man's chest, not to push him away, to anchor herself. She tilted her head up, closing her eyes, and surrendered to him. The kiss wasn't a drunken mistake. It wasn't a fleeting, awkward collision of lips. It was slow. It was desperate. It was the kind of kiss shared by people who had been starving for each other, a kiss that held years of unspoken gravity. Time dilated. The ambient noise of the party, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the jazz mutated into a dull, underwater roar in William's ears. He felt a cold, sharp blade of reality slide between his ribs. The world he had built, the marriage he had nurtured with every ounce of his soul, dissolved into ash right before his eyes. A waiter passed by, and William mechanically took a glass of Merlot from the silver tray, his fingers numb. He looked back at the alcove. They were still kissing. A tremor started in William's right hand. It wasn't anger. It was the fundamental breakdown of his nervous system trying to process an impossible truth. His grip faltered. The crystal wine glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. A splash of deep red wine bled across the white stone like a fresh wound. The sound wasn't loud enough to stop the music, but in the alcove, it was a gunshot. Margot broke the kiss, gasping softly. She turned her head, her eyes wide, glassy, and flushed with a passion William hadn't seen in years. Her gaze cut through the dimly lit room. It bypassed the crowd, the shadows, and locked directly onto William. For 2 seconds, the universe held its breath. William saw the exact moment the intoxication drained from his wife's face, replaced by a stark, absolute terror. Her lips parted, forming his name silently in the heavy air. William didn't yell. He didn't rush forward to tear the man away. The dignity that had built his empire now caged his rage. His face remained a mask of stone, though his eyes were completely, devastatingly dead. He held her gaze for one more agonizing second, letting her see the exact moment his love for her fractured. Then slowly, deliberately, William turned his back on the emerald dress, stepping over the shattered glass and the spilled red wine, and walked out into the freezing Chicago night. The drive back to the Meridian penthouse was a blur of neon streaks and freezing rain. William sat in the back of the town car, his hands resting perfectly still on his knees. He didn't text her. He didn't call. He just watched the slick streets of downtown Chicago bleed past the tinted glass, his mind a sudden, terrifying void. When the private elevator doors slid open directly into their foyer, the silence of the massive apartment hit him like a physical blow. The space, designed by a renowned minimalist architect to reflect warmth and modern elegance, now felt indistinguishable from a mausoleum. He didn't reach for the light switch. The pale metallic glow of the city skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows was enough to navigate the graveyard of his marriage. He walked into the sunken living area, his footsteps swallowed by the plush Persian rugs. Every object in the room, the abstract bronze sculpture they had bought together in Milan, the framed photograph of them laughing on a sailboat off the Amalfi Coast, felt like a carefully constructed lie. He took off his tailored coat, draped it meticulously over the back of the white leather sofa, and slowly loosened his tie. He poured himself 2 fingers of neat bourbon from the crystal decanter on the bar cart, but he didn't drink it. He simply took the glass and sat in the wingback armchair in the darkest corner of the room, half swallowed by the shadows, and waited. 1 hour. 2 hours. The waiting was a specific kind of psychological torture. His brain, usually a brilliant analytical machine capable of dissecting complex market trends and corporate acquisitions, was entirely paralyzed by a single, looping reel of film. Margot's hand pressed flush against a stranger's chest, her eyes closed in absolute tragic surrender. What was she doing right now? Was she crying in the opulent bathroom of the lounge? Or was she still with him, hastily straightening her emerald dress in the back of a cab, whispering panicked, breathless apologies to a man who was not her husband? At 1:45 a.m., the elevator chimes echoed softly through the hollow apartment. The mechanical hum seemed to vibrate through the floorboards directly into William's chest. The heavy oak door clicked open, and the faint, familiar scent of her expensive perfume drifted into the entry hall, now smelling distinctly like treason. "William?" Her voice was thin, a fragile thread trembling in the dark. He didn't answer. He didn't move a single muscle. She stepped into the living room, the ambient city light catching the pale shock of her face. She still wore the emerald silk, but the immaculate, untouchable aura of the society wife was completely gone. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup faintly smudged at the edges of her eyes. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. When she finally saw his silhouette in the armchair, she stopped dead. A sharp, audible intake of breath hitched in her throat. The physical distance between them was only 20 feet, but the chasm felt infinite. "William, please," she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched a small, silver evening bag to her chest, like a shield. "Let me explain. It wasn't what it looked like. I swear to you." The cliché of the lie was almost insulting. It lacked the sophistication he expected from her. William slowly turned his head, his eyes, completely devoid of the warmth and devotion she had relied on for 7 years, met hers through the gloom. He didn't yell. He didn't hurl the heavy crystal glass of bourbon at the wall. He simply let the suffocating silence stretch until the air in the room felt too thick, too toxic to breathe. The coldness radiating from him was absolute. A calculated, terrifying detachment that frightened her far more than any violent outburst could have. "Take off the dress, Margot," he said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, completely flat, echoing in the cavernous room. "And sleep in the guest room. We have a board meeting at 9. He turned his gaze back to the glowing, indifferent city, leaving her standing frozen in the dark. Dawn broke over Lake Michigan, not with warmth, but with a pale, unforgiving gray light that washed the Meridian penthouse in the colors of concrete and ash. William had not slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night staring at the ceiling of the master bedroom, feeling the phantom weight of a woman who was no longer his wife sleeping in the guest wing down the hall. By 7 in the morning, his armor was fully assembled. He was freshly showered, perfectly shaved, and dressed in a bespoke navy suit that felt heavier than usual. He walked into the expansive marble kitchen, the silence of the apartment pressing against his eardrums. The routine was ingrained in his muscle memory. Turn on the espresso machine, grind the dark roast beans, wait for the hiss of steam. For 7 years, he had pulled 2 shots. One for him, black, one for Margot, with a splash of oat milk, brought to her bedside before she even opened her eyes. Today, William placed a single porcelain cup beneath the spout. The solitary drip of the dark liquid was the only sound in the cavernous room. He heard the soft, hesitant padding of bare feet against the hardwood floor before he saw her. Margot stopped at the threshold of the kitchen. She was wearing a thick cashmere robe pulled tightly around her waist, her hair tied in a messy, defeated knot. The flawless, untouchable society queen from the Sapphire Lounge was gone, replaced by a woman who looked visibly hollowed out. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, a testament to a night spent weeping in the guest room. William did not look up. He picked up his cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee tasted like ash. "William," she started, her voice raspy, breaking on the second syllable. She took a step forward, her hands twisting the fabric of her robe. "Please, you didn't come to bed. You haven't said a word since—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what had happened was too ugly to vocalize in the pristine, sunlit kitchen. He set the cup down on the marble counter. The ceramic clinked sharply, making her flinch. "Please," Margot begged, the desperation bleeding through her aristocratic restraint. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill. "Yell at me, scream, break something. Do anything but look at me like I don't exist. Let me tell you what happened. It was a mistake, a momentary stupid lapse in judgment. He means nothing to me." The lie hung in the air, pathetic and transparent. A momentary lapse did not look like the devastating, soul-deep surrender he had witnessed in the alcove. William slowly turned his head to look at her. His face was a masterclass in composure, utterly devoid of the furious, passionate man she knew. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical assessment of a businessman evaluating a bad asset. "It is 7:15, William said, his voice terrifyingly steady, modulated to the exact pitch he used during hostile corporate takeovers. He checked the Patek Philippe watch on his left wrist, a gift she had given him on their 3rd anniversary. "We have the quarterly review board meeting at Sinclair Ventures at 9 sharp. The senior partners are flying in from New York." Margot stared at him, her breath hitching, utterly unmoored by his response. "William, how can you talk about the board meeting right now? How can you—" "I suggest you begin getting ready," William interrupted smoothly, his tone slicing through her panic like a surgical blade. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Wear the gray Armani suit. It projects stability. And fix your makeup. We cannot afford to look entirely incompetent in front of Mark Stevens this morning." He didn't wait for her reply. He didn't ask about the man in the dark suit. He didn't ask why. He simply picked up his leather briefcase from the dining table, walked past her without brushing her shoulder, and stepped into the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing Margot alone in the deafening silence of the penthouse, leaving her to realize that the punishment had just begun. The glass-walled conference room of Sinclair Ventures hovered 40 stories above the Chicago River, a sterile ecosystem of polished mahogany, chrome, and ruthless ambition. William sat at the head of the long table, the city sprawling out behind him in a bleak, wintry panorama. To his immediate right sat Margot. She had worn the gray Armani suit, just as he had instructed. It was a flawless armor of wool and silk that clung perfectly to her frame, projecting an image of unshakable stability and quiet wealth. Her makeup was immaculate, hiding the dark circles of a sleepless, weeping night beneath layers of expensive foundation. To the 5 senior partners who had flown in from New York, she was the quintessential Sinclair heiress, poised, brilliant, and deeply devoted to the man who ran her family's empire. To William, she was a stranger wearing his wife's face. The meeting was a grueling 3-hour dissection of a tech acquisition in Silicon Valley. For the first 2 hours, William operated on pure mechanical adrenaline. He navigated the aggressive questioning with his usual surgical precision, his voice a calm, authoritative baritone that commanded absolute respect in the room. He was a man who had built himself from nothing, and he refused to let the ghost of a stranger from the Sapphire Lounge dismantle his professional legacy. But the true torture began when the presentation shifted to the integration strategy, a segment they traditionally handled together. William is entirely correct regarding the valuation, Margot chimed in, her voice smooth and modulated. She leaned forward slightly, seamlessly picking up the thread of his argument. To emphasize her support, an ingrained habit of 7 years, she reached out and placed her hand lightly over his on the mahogany table. It was a microscopic gesture, a display of unity that usually charmed the board. Today, her touch felt like a branding iron against his skin. Every muscle in William's forearm instantly went rigid. He didn't pull his hand away. That would have been a catastrophic breach of protocol, but the sheer force of will required to keep his fingers from curling into a fist was agonizing. He felt a cold sweat prickle at the base of his neck, his stomach churning with physical nausea. He stared blankly at the quarterly projection slides on the screen, feeling the sickening reality of his existence. Their marriage was not just a legal binding, it was the bedrock of Sinclair Ventures. Disentangling himself from Margot meant untangling $1 billion portfolio. She was woven into his life, his money, his reputation. From the opposite end of the table, Mark Stevens leaned back in his leather chair. Mark was a junior partner, sharp, hungry, and dangerously observant. While the New York executives were nodding along to Margot's smooth financial rhetoric, Mark was not looking at the presentation. He was looking at William's hand. Mark noticed the absolute unnatural stillness of William's fingers beneath Margot's touch. He noticed the rigid set of William's jaw, the subtle, almost imperceptible way William had shifted his weight away from his wife. When William finally spoke again to close the deal, his tone was completely devoid of the usual warmth he reserved for his partner. It was hollow, mechanical. "We will finalize the term sheet by Friday," William said, smoothly withdrawing his hand the absolute millisecond it was socially acceptable to do so. He closed his leather folder with a definitive snap. "Thank you, gentlemen." As the room dissolved into polite handshakes and the scraping of chairs, Margot let out a quiet, trembling breath of relief, believing they had survived the performance. But as William gathered his documents, he met Mark Stevens' eyes across the table. Mark offered a slow, calculating nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had seen the cracks in the porcelain. The facade was holding, but William knew with terrifying certainty that he could not live the rest of his life as an actor in his own tragedy. The sanctuary of William's corner office felt entirely different after the board meeting. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing him inside a soundproof vault of leather, glass, and expensive art. For the first time in his professional life, the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline offered no comfort. He walked over to the expansive mahogany desk, but he did not sit. He simply placed his palms flat against the cool wood, closing his eyes as a wave of profound, suffocating exhaustion washed over him. He needed a name. The faceless shadow in the midnight blue suit had to be dragged into the light. Until the man had an identity, he was a phantom, an invincible ghost haunting the wreckage of William's mind. William pressed the silver button on his intercom. His voice, when he spoke, was a masterclass in casual authority. "Emily, could you step in here for a moment?" Seconds later, Emily Burton entered. She was a woman of formidable efficiency, having managed William's professional life for the past 4 years. She held a sleek silver tablet against her chest, her expression expectant. "Yes, Mr. Carter? Did you need the revised term sheets for the New York partners?" "Not yet," William said, moving to sit in his high-back leather chair. He adjusted his cuffs, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I need you to pull up the final attendance log and security registry from the Sapphire Lounge last night. There was a gentleman I spoke with briefly near the terrace doors. I meant to get his card, but we were interrupted. I'd like to send him a follow-up." Emily tapped the screen of her tablet, her brow furrowing slightly in concentration. "Of course. Do you remember his name or his firm?" "No," William lied smoothly. though his heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Tall, dark hair. He was wearing a dark blue suit. He would have arrived late, likely within the 30 minutes before I got there. Emily scrolled through the digital manifest. The silence in the office stretched, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic tapping of her manicured fingernail against the glass screen. William watched her, his breath trapped in his throat. Every second felt like an hour. Let's see, Emily murmured, her eyes scanning the data. The corporate list was strictly managed. Most of the late arrivals were junior associates from the legal department. But wait, she stopped scrolling. A faint look of confusion crossed her features. What is it? William asked, his voice dangerously quiet. There was an addition to the guest list, Emily explained, stepping closer to the desk to show him the screen. He wasn't on the original corporate roster or the +1 registry. The security desk flagged a manual entry at 7:15 last evening, just an hour before the event started. William stared at the screen, though the text was too small for him to read from his chair. The cold blade he had felt the night before twisted deeper into his gut. A manual entry? William asked, his tone flat. Yes, Emily nodded, looking up at him. Mrs. Carter called the venue's head of security directly to bypass the standard RSVP protocol. She authorized a VIP pass to be held at the door for him. The air in the room instantly evaporated. It wasn't a random encounter. It wasn't a crasher who had slipped past the velvet ropes. Margot had planned it. While William had been sitting on a delayed flight on the tarmac in New York, his wife had been making phone calls to ensure her lover had a front-row seat to their anniversary gala. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the betrayal paralyzed him. I see, William managed to say, his voice sounding hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. He forced himself to look at Emily, his expression a flawless mask of mild professional interest. And what name did my wife leave at the door? Emily looked back at the tablet. Gray, she read aloud. Brandon Gray. William did not blink. He did not move. He simply let the name drop into the silence of the room like a stone into a dark, bottomless well. Brandon Gray. It was a name that meant absolutely nothing to his corporate world, yet it carried an ominous, suffocating weight that told William his entire life was about to burn to the ground. Thank you, Emily, William said quietly, dismissing her with a subtle nod. That will be all. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, William finally exhaled, the sound trembling and broken in the empty room. When Emily's footsteps finally faded down the carpeted hallway, William locked the door to his office. He bypassed his desktop computer, fully aware that Sinclair Ventures' IT department monitored all network traffic. Instead, he opened his leather briefcase and pulled out his personal laptop. He sat in the heavy silence, the name echoing in his skull. Brandon Gray. William was a man who traded in information. He understood that data was emotionless. It did not care about broken hearts or shattered egos. He opened a secure browser, his fingers hovering over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before he began typing. A simple search for Brandon Gray Chicago yielded thousands of irrelevant results. Lawyers, accountants, a high school basketball coach. William refined the parameters. He knew Margot's world. He knew the circles she moved in, the charities she patronized, the galleries she frequented. He typed Brandon Gray plus Chicago plus art or gallery. The screen populated instantly. The fourth link down was an archived article from a boutique Chicago arts publication, dated exactly 8 years ago. A year before William had even been introduced to the Sinclair family. The headline read, Rising Steel, the Visceral Sculptures of Brandon Gray. William clicked the link. The page loaded slowly, rendering a high-resolution photograph at the top of the article. The air in the office grew perfectly still. William stopped breathing. It was a black and white image taken at a gritty industrial warehouse exhibition in the West Loop. In the center of the frame stood the man from the Sapphire Lounge. He was younger, his jawline sharper, dressed in a faded denim shirt rather than a bespoke suit. But the intense, brooding eyes were unmistakably the same. But it was the woman standing next to him that made William's blood run cold. It was Margot. She looked entirely different from the composed, armored executive who sat next to him in boardrooms. Her hair was loose and unstyled, cascading over the collar of a worn leather jacket. She was laughing, her face turned toward Brandon, her eyes shining with a raw, unfiltered adoration that William had never, not once in 7 years, seen directed at him. Brandon's arm was wrapped possessively around her waist, his chin resting against her temple. They were not just acquaintances, they were profoundly, undeniably in love. William scrolled down, his eyes skimming the text mechanically. The article praised Brandon's raw talent, but noted his lack of formal funding and his refusal to cater to the elite commercial gallery scene. He was a brilliant, starving artist. He was everything the aristocratic Sinclair family despised. The timeline snapped into place with sickening clarity. 8 years ago, Margot was deeply entangled with a penniless sculptor. 7.5 years ago, Margot's father, Richard Sinclair, had invited William, a rising star in wealth management, a man with impeccable credentials and endless ambition, to a private dinner. 6 months later, William and Margot were engaged. William closed the laptop. The screen went black, reflecting his own pale, rigid face. The kiss at the lounge was not a mistake. It was not a momentary lapse of judgment or a spark of sudden temptation. It was a resurrection. William realized with a devastating, soul-crushing finality that he had never truly won Margot's heart. He was an acquisition. He was the safe, lucrative merger orchestrated by her family to ensure her financial stability and social standing, while Brandon Gray was the passion she had been forced to bury. She hadn't just cheated on him. She had used him. Their wedding, their vows, their 7 years of shared history. It was all a beautifully constructed, highly profitable lie. He had spent his entire marriage living in the shadow of a ghost, proudly polishing a trophy that had always belonged to another man. William leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He did not cry. The betrayal was too absolute, too vast for tears. Instead, a terrifying, icy clarity washed over him. He finally understood the game, and he knew exactly how he was going to end it. It was 2 a.m. when the penthouse finally settled into complete stillness. William sat at the head of the long dining table, the only illumination coming from the harsh, blue glow of his laptop screen and the sprawling city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. He had printed the photograph, the black and white image from 8 years ago. It lay face up on the dark, polished mahogany. He heard the faint rustle of silk before he saw her. Margot emerged from the hallway, seeking a glass of water, unable to sleep in the suffocating silence of the guest wing. She froze when she saw his silhouette sitting in the dark. "William," she whispered, her voice fragile. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the photograph. "Sit down, Margot." She approached slowly, pulling her robe tighter around her waist as if bracing for a physical blow. She took the seat opposite him, her eyes darting nervously between his rigid posture and the piece of paper. William placed 2 fingers on the printed sheet and pushed it across the smooth wood. It slid with a soft hiss, stopping exactly in front of her. Margot looked down. The blood instantly drained from her face. Her breathing hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the quiet room. "His name is Brandon Gray," William said. His voice was conversational, completely devoid of malice, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "A sculptor. This article is from a year before your father introduced us at the country club." "William, please," she started, her eyes welling with tears, her hands trembling as they hovered over the image. "Do not insult my intelligence by calling him a mistake again," William interrupted smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "A mistake is a fleeting lapse in judgment. This is an era. Tell me, Margot, when you stood at the altar and promised me your life, were you thinking of him?" She covered her face with her hands, a choked sob escaping her lips. "It wasn't like that. You have to believe me. I loved you. I do love you." "You loved the stability I provided," William corrected, his tone surgical and precise. "You loved that I was a rising star in wealth management. More importantly, your father loved it. Richard Sinclair wouldn't let his daughter marry a starving artist from the West Loop, would he? He needed a merger, someone respectable, someone safe." Margot lowered her hands. Her mascara was running, her aristocratic poise completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, broken woman. "My father threatened to cut me off entirely," she whispered, the ugly truth finally spilling out into the cold room. Brandon had nothing. He was volatile, brilliant, but he couldn't survive in our world. My father made it clear that if I stayed with him, I would lose my family, my inheritance, everything. And then I met you. And I was the perfect solution, William finished for her, the pieces of his life clicking together to form a devastating picture. I was ambitious enough to run the family firm and blind enough to think you actually wanted me. I chose you, she pleaded, leaning across the table. William withdrew his hands, folding them in his lap to avoid her reach. You chose the path of least resistance. You chose your comfort over him. And you chose to use me as the shield to protect your lifestyle. He reached out to me 2 months ago, Margot confessed, her voice trembling violently. He had a gallery opening. He sent an invitation to the house. I went just to say congratulations. I swear, William, I meant for it to be one conversation. But seeing him reminded you of what it felt like to be alive, William said softly, the realization settling heavily in his chest. While I've spent 7 years playing the role of your husband, thinking I had built an empire with the woman I loved, I was just the caretaker. Margot wept openly now, the sound echoing miserably in the cavernous room. I'm so sorry. I'll never see him again. I'll block his number. We can go to counseling. Please, William, don't throw this away. William stood up. He looked down at the woman he had devoted his life to, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow pity. I can't throw away something I never truly had, Margot, he said quietly. He left the photograph on the table and walked away, leaving her alone with the ghost she had invited into their home. The West Loop of Chicago retained a gritty, industrial edge that the executives at Sinclair Ventures usually only viewed from the safety of a luxury town car. William stepped onto the cracked pavement, the freezing wind biting through his cashmere coat. He had tracked the address from the gallery's public registry. It was a modest, independent coffee house situated directly beneath a converted warehouse studio. William walked in. The air smelled of roasted beans and damp wool. It didn't take long to find him. Brandon Gray was sitting at a small, scuffed wooden table near the back window, sketching in a leather-bound notebook. In the harsh daylight, he looked older than the photograph, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from years of financial instability, but his dark eyes retained a sharp, unyielding intensity. He wore a faded charcoal sweater, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms dusted with faint traces of dried clay and charcoal. William approached the table with the silent, predatory grace of a man accustomed to owning whatever room he entered. He pulled out the opposite metal chair and sat down without an invitation. Brandon did not flinch. He slowly stopped sketching, his charcoal pencil coming to a halt on the rough paper. He looked up, studying the immaculate navy suit, the silk tie, and finally the ice-cold hollow eyes of the man sitting across from him. Recognition flickered instantly. "Mr. Carter," Brandon said. His voice was deep, entirely devoid of the panic or guilt William had expected. There was no scrambling for excuses. "Mr. Gray," William replied, his tone perfectly flat. He rested his hands on the table. His nails were neatly manicured. Brandon's knuckles were scarred and stained. The physical contrast between them was a stark summary of Margot's divided life. "I wondered if you would come," Brandon murmured, closing his notebook. He leaned back, holding William's gaze with a terrifying calmness. "She told me you saw us." "She told you," William repeated, the words tasting like ash. The fact that they had communicated, that they had discussed him and his reaction, was a fresh violation. "Then you also know that you have jeopardized a multi-million-dollar corporate structure, not just a marriage." A faint, almost pitying smile touched Brandon's lips. It was the smile of a man who believed he held the moral high ground. "You view everything as a transaction, don't you?" Brandon said softly, leaning forward. "A corporate structure, an asset, a contract. You bought a beautiful bird, Mr. Carter. You put her in a penthouse in the sky, you draped her in silk, and you fed her security. But you never noticed that she was suffocating." William's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The urge to reach across the table and wrap his hands around the artist's throat was a sudden, violent flare in his chest, but his iron discipline held it back. "I provided for my wife," William stated, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I built an empire with her. You built an empire for her father, Brandon corrected smoothly, his eyes flashing with a protective, possessive fire. Richard Sinclair sold her to the highest bidder to save his own legacy. She didn't choose you, William. She surrendered to you. She came back to me because with me, she actually has a pulse. She's alive. The words were not delivered with malice, which made them infinitely more devastating. They were delivered with absolute, unwavering certainty. Brandon did not see himself as the interloper. He saw himself as the rightful owner, reclaiming what had been stolen from him. She is legally bound to me, William said, though the argument suddenly felt painfully hollow. Lawyers can undo paper, Brandon replied, taking a sip of his black coffee, his eyes never leaving William's. They can't undo history. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Carter. I lost her once to your world. I will not lose her again. William stared at the man. He had come here expecting a villain, a sleazy opportunist he could crush with a team of corporate attorneys or a private settlement. Instead, he found a man fundamentally, irrevocably in love with Margot. And the most agonizing realization of all washed over William as he slowly stood up from the table. Brandon Gray was right. William had never owned Margot's heart. He was merely the warden of her golden cage. Enjoy your coffee, mister. Gray, William said quietly, turning his back on the ghost who had finally stepped into the light and walked out into the freezing Chicago wind. The heavy mahogany doors of William's private study in the penthouse clicked shut, sealing him in with the ghosts of his ambition. It was past midnight. The encounter with Brandon Gray still hummed in his veins, a toxic undercurrent to the chilling reality he now faced. He did not go to the liquor cabinet. He needed absolute surgical clarity. He walked to the wall safe hidden behind a first edition maritime oil painting, punched in the 6-digit code, Margot's birth date, a cruel irony he noted with a tightening jaw, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. It was the master operating agreement for Sinclair Ventures, alongside the post-nuptial contract Richard Sinclair had insisted upon 3 years into the marriage. William spread the heavy parchment pages across his desk, turning on the brass reading lamp. The warm light illuminated the cold, hard math of his existence. When he had married Margot, he brought relentless drive and a brilliant mind. She brought the aristocratic name and the initial capital. Over 7 years, William had multiplied that capital tenfold. He had built the empire. But looking at the microscopic legal print, the trap Richard Sinclair had constructed was glaringly obvious. William controlled 40% of the voting shares. Margot controlled 40%. The remaining 20% was held by a trust entirely loyal to the Sinclair patriarch. Clause 4.2.a of the operating agreement was a guillotine waiting to drop. In the event of a dissolution of marriage, Margot retained the right to trigger a mandatory buyout of William's shares at a pre-calculated valuation that completely ignored the firm's current market explosion. Worse, a morality clause, ironically designed to keep William in line, stated that any public scandal bringing disrepute to the firm could force an immediate vote of no confidence. If William filed for divorce and cited her infidelity, the ensuing legal bloodbath would inevitably become public. The Sinclair family lawyers, a legion of the most ruthless litigators in Chicago, would drag the proceedings through the mud. They would spin the narrative, protect their daughter at all costs, and utilize the resulting instability to oust him from the CEO position. He would lose the firm. He would lose the very thing he had sacrificed his youth, his energy, and his soul to build. William leaned back in his leather chair, the silence of the room pressing down on his chest with the weight of a physical stone. He stared at his own signature at the bottom of the contract. He had signed it willingly, blinded by the illusion of partnership and love. He had forged his own golden handcuffs. Brandon Gray's words echoed in the quiet room. You built an empire for her father. The artist was right. William was nothing but a highly compensated mercenary, holding the throne warm for the Sinclair bloodline. The dilemma he faced was no longer just about a broken heart. It was an existential crisis. If he walked away from Margot to preserve his dignity, he would be walking out into the cold, stripped of his life's work, leaving it in the hands of the very people who had orchestrated his betrayal. If he stayed, he would be complicit in his own humiliation, playing the dutiful husband while his wife's heart belonged to a ghost in the West Loop. He looked out the window at the glittering Chicago skyline, a city he had conquered, suddenly feeling like a prisoner in a glass cell. The stakes had shifted from the personal to the absolute. He had to choose between his empire and his soul, and for the first time in his meticulously planned life, William Carter felt entirely trapped by his own success. The Metropolitan Gallery was ablaze with 1,000 points of artificial light. Tonight was the annual Winter Gala, a mandatory cornerstone of Chicago's philanthropic season. For Sinclair Ventures, it was a vital display of power and benevolence. For William Carter, it was a flawlessly choreographed execution. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, staccato rhythm as William and Margot stepped out of the Blacktown car. The biting December wind swept off Lake Michigan, but Margot did not shiver. She was draped in liquid silver silk, her posture impossibly straight, a magnificent diamond necklace sitting like a collar of ice against her throat. She linked her arm through William's, her grip firm and possessive, playing the role of the adoring wife with a terrifying, Oscar-worthy precision. "Smile, darling," she murmured through perfectly parted lips, her voice barely audible beneath the roar of the press line. William smiled. It was a mechanical, muscular response, completely disconnected from the freezing void in his chest. He placed his hand over hers, presenting the illusion of an unbreakable union to the society photographers. Inside the grand atrium, beneath the soaring glass ceiling, the elite of the city circulated like sharks in a gilded tank. For 2 hours, William watched his wife work the room. He stood a few paces behind her, holding a flute of untouched champagne, observing her not as a husband, but as a forensic investigator examining a crime scene. He watched her charm a notoriously difficult hedge fund manager with a light, musical laugh. He saw her navigate a conversation with a senior senator, her eyes wide with feigned, breathless interest. Every gesture, every tilt of her head, every subtle touch to a VIP's forearm was calculated. It was a masterclass in social manipulation, a skill refined by generations of Sinclair breeding. Before the Sapphire Lounge, William had viewed her grace as a reflection of her inner warmth, a natural elegance that he felt privileged to stand beside. Now, stripped of his blind devotion, he saw the cold machinery beneath the porcelain skin. The horrifying truth settled over him like a heavy, suffocating shroud. The woman he had loved for 7 years had never existed. The Margot who brewed him coffee, who discussed merger strategies in bed, who kissed his cheek before boarding a flight, that woman was a carefully constructed avatar. She was a survival mechanism built to appease Richard Sinclair and secure her position in the stratosphere of Chicago society. The real Margot Sinclair was the wild, desperate woman in the West Loop warehouse, the woman whose soul belonged to a starving artist, the woman who kissed Brandon Gray with a ravenous hunger in the shadows. William was just the bank that funded the theater. "William?" Her voice broke through his thoughts. He blinked, the grand hall coming back into sharp focus. Margot was looking up at him, her silver gown shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. The string quartet had transitioned into a slow waltz, signaling the formal opening of the dance floor. "They are waiting for us," she whispered, a flicker of genuine anxiety briefly breaking through her polished facade. She needed him to validate her performance. She needed the shield to stay firmly in place. William looked down at her. He searched her eyes, looking for any trace of the woman he thought he had married, but he found only a terrified stranger trapped in a beautiful cage of her own making. "Of course," William said quietly, his voice devoid of any human warmth. He led her to the center of the marble floor. He placed one hand lightly on her waist and took her hand in his. They moved together, perfectly in sync, a flawless picture of high society romance. But as they turned under the brilliant lights surrounded by hundreds of watching eyes, William had never felt more entirely, devastatingly alone. The ghost of his marriage was gone. Only the business remained, and he knew exactly how to close the deal. The ride back to the Meridian penthouse was cloaked in the heavy, suffocating silence that had become the defining characteristic of their marriage. The soundproof partition in the town car was raised, sealing William and Margot in a private, leather-scented vacuum. Outside, the freezing December rain blurred the neon lights of downtown Chicago into meaningless, jagged streaks of color. Margot sat rigidly on the opposite side of the seat. The adrenaline of the Metropolitan Gallery Gala was rapidly fading, leaving behind the stark, terrifying reality of their fractured existence. She stared down at her lap, the magnificent diamond necklace suddenly looking more like a glittering shackle than a symbol of royalty. "I meant what I said to Senator Hayes," Margot whispered, her voice trembling, breaking the quiet hum of the engine. "About our future, about the expansion of the foundation." William kept his gaze fixed on the rain-swept window. He did not reply. The lack of response shattered whatever remained of her composure. She slid across the leather seat, reaching out to grasp his forearm. Her fingers were ice-cold against the wool of his tuxedo. "William, look at me, please." The aristocratic poise she had wielded so effortlessly all evening was entirely gone. Tears spilled over her flawless makeup, carving dark paths down her pale cheeks. "I know you're angry. You have every right to despise me. But you have to believe me. I am choosing you. I am choosing our life." He slowly turned his head. He looked down at her hands gripping his sleeve with white-knuckled desperation, then up to her tear-filled eyes. "Are you?" William asked softly. His voice held no anger, no malice, only a profound, devastating emptiness. "Yes," she choked out, her grip tightening as if she could physically anchor him to her. "I haven't spoken to Brandon since that night. I blocked his number. I told the building's security he is never to be allowed near the penthouse. He is in the past, William. I swear to you, you are my present. You are my husband." She leaned forward, burying her face against his shoulder, weeping softly into the dark fabric of his suit. It was a picture of absolute surrender. A lesser man, a man still blinded by the illusion of her love, might have wrapped his arms around her. He might have accepted the apology, taking comfort in the victory over the other man, choosing the beautiful lie over the agonizing truth. But William Carter was no longer blind. As he sat perfectly still, letting her cry against his shoulder, he listened to the cadence of her panic. He didn't hear the desperation of a woman terrified of losing her soulmate. He heard the sheer, unadulterated terror of a woman who realized the golden walls of her fortress were crumbling. She wasn't mourning the death of his trust. She was mourning the potential loss of Sinclair Ventures. She was terrified of Richard Sinclair's wrath if a public scandal erupted and dismantled the family legacy. She was frightened of losing the penthouse, the private jets, the untouchable status she held in the city. She was begging the bank to stay open. Brandon Gray had offered her raw passion, but Brandon Gray couldn't offer her a safety net. When the reality of losing everything set in, she had sprinted back to the vault, desperate to lock the heavy steel doors behind her. "It will take time," Margot babbled on, mistaking his stillness for consideration. "I know it will take years, but I will do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. We can rebuild. We built the firm together, William. We can fix this." "Yes," William said quietly, his eyes returning to the bleak, indifferent city slipping past the glass. The single word was hollow, a mechanical concession to stop the tears he could no longer bear to witness. "We built the firm." He did not touch her. He simply endured her presence for the remainder of the drive, his mind already miles away, meticulously finalizing the arithmetic of his departure. The illusion was complete, and its absolute finality brought him a cold, terrifying peace. Dawn broke over Chicago, not with a brilliant sunrise, but with a slow, melancholic bleed of pale violet and steel gray light. Lake Michigan stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, looking like a sheet of bruised iron under the winter sky. William Carter stood in the center of the vast, silent living room. He was not wearing a bespoke suit or the armor of a Sinclair executive. He wore a simple dark sweater and an old wool coat he had owned long before Richard Sinclair ever invited him to dinner. At his feet sat a single leather duffel bag containing a few changes of clothes, his passport, and nothing else. No stocks, no corporate laptops, none of the trappings of the empire he had spent 7 years building. He moved to the heavy mahogany dining table. The silence of the apartment was no longer suffocating. It was the quiet, sacred stillness of a tomb after the morning had ended. From his inner pocket, he withdrew a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. It was his formal resignation as co-director of Sinclair Ventures, effective immediately, alongside a legal waiver surrendering his voting shares to the Sinclair Family Trust. He was giving them exactly what they had always wanted. The fortress, fully built and highly profitable, without the burden of the outsider who had constructed it. Fighting a corporate war would only keep him tethered to the ghost of his marriage. True freedom required walking away with empty hands. He placed the document on the polished wood. A faint rustle of fabric broke the silence. William turned his head. Margot stood at the edge of the hallway. She looked entirely fragile in the harsh morning light, wrapped in her silk robe, the remnants of yesterday's immaculate gala makeup smeared beneath her swollen eyes. She saw the leather duffel bag. She saw the resignation letter on the table. The reality of the moment hit her, draining whatever color remained in her pale cheeks. "William," she breathed, the word trembling in the frigid air between them. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes wide with a sudden, absolute panic. "What are you doing? You can't leave. The board, the acquisition. You'll lose everything. You are walking away from your entire life." William looked at her. He felt no rage. He felt no urge to scream or punish her. Looking at the aristocratic heiress trembling in her multi-million-dollar penthouse, he only felt a profound, tragic pity. She was terrified of losing her shield, while he was finally stepping out of the crossfire. He looked down at his left hand. The platinum wedding band caught the faint, violet light of the dawn. It had always felt heavy, but today he recognized the weight for what it truly was, a shackle disguised as a promise. Slowly, deliberately, William slid the ring off his finger. "No," Margot whimpered, a choked, broken sound, as she watched the metal clear his knuckle. "Please, William, don't do this. I don't want to lose you." He set the platinum band down on the mahogany table, resting it perfectly in the center of the resignation letter. The soft clink of the metal against the wood was the final, definitive punctuation of their 7 years together. William picked up his duffel bag. He looked across the room at the woman he had once worshipped, seeing past the elegant facade to the terrified, captive soul beneath. "I didn't lose you, Margot," William said quietly, his voice carrying the calm, devastating beauty of absolute closure. "I just finally woke up from the dream you built for me." He didn't wait for her tears. He turned his back on the penthouse, the shattered illusions, and the ghost of a love he never truly owned. The heavy elevator doors slid open, and William Carter stepped inside, descending into the cold, sharp reality of the Chicago morning, leaving the empire behind to breathe on his own.